The fog was heavy that morning, thicker than cream, swallowing the fields of southern Indiana in a ghostly veil. Locals always said the air changed when you got close to the old Hensley farm. Some claimed it was just the swampy land. Others swore the trees whispered names no one should hear. But I know better. I've seen what lies behind those rotted doors, and I still remember what the dog did. Or rather, what it didn't do. My name doesn't matter. What matters is the diary I found buried under a loose floorboard in the farmhouse my grandfather left me. I'd heard whispers in the family about the land nobody wanted, but I thought they were just stories told to kids to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. Then I found Abigail Hensley's journal, and everything changed. It started the day I arrived to assess the place, maybe fix it up, maybe sell it. I wasn't expecting much. The house stood crooked on its foundation, paint peeled like sunburnt skin, and vines had grown into the siding like they were trying to strangle it. The porch sagged in the middle. The front door groaned open like a creature waking from a long, bitter sleep. I brought a dog with me, Duke, a sturdy German shepherd who had never flinched at thunderstorms or gunfire. He followed close as I stepped through the entryway, sniffing the air, alert but calm. Dust floated like ash in the dim light that leaked through the torn curtains. The place smelled of rot, old mold, and something else I couldn't quite name. I walked through the parlor, then the kitchen, noting warped floorboards, broken furniture, and silence so thick it pressed against the skin. But it was only when I approached the hallway that Duke stopped dead. I turned to see him standing at the threshold, his body rigid, ears flat and tail tucked low. He didn't growl, he didn't bark. He simply stared at the darkness ahead and began to whimper. "Come on," I said softly, patting my thigh. "It's just a hallway." He backed away, eyes locked on something I couldn't see. I took a few more steps forward, and he turned and bolted out the door. That was the first sign something wasn't right. I spent the night in town, couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how Duke had reacted, like he'd seen something waiting in the dark. The next morning I returned alone and began poking around the house again. That's when I found it, hidden beneath a warped floorboard in the upstairs bedroom, a small leather-bound book tied with a frayed ribbon. On the first page, written in neat, slanted script, "This is the record of what happened to my family. My name is Abigail Hensley. If you're reading this, it's already too late." I sat down and read the first few pages in silence, heart pounding. Abigail's voice was soft, intelligent, but it trembled between the lines like someone afraid the paper itself might judge her. She wrote of a farm life full of hardship, faith, and rituals passed down without question. Her family had lived on that land since the early 1800s. Her father, Jonah, was a devout man. Her mother, Ruth, deeply sensitive, prone to weeping in the mornings. Her younger brother, Elijah, full of life but often sickly. They kept to themselves. As I read, I realized this wasn't just a family diary. It was a warning. She spoke of the house's hallway as a place of dread. Even as a child, she knew it was different, colder, always a little too dark. And then came the animals, how they refused to cross it, how her mother would sweep salt along the floorboards every Sunday, murmuring words Abigail couldn't understand. My skin crawled. There was a sketch tucked between the pages, an outline of the hallway with strange symbols etched near the baseboards. One matched something I'd noticed carved faintly into the wood near the base of the door when Duke had stopped. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now I couldn't stop thinking about it. I closed the diary and looked out the cracked window toward the tree line beyond the fields. The wind was still. The air felt tight, as if the land itself was holding its breath. I told myself I'd read more tomorrow, that maybe it was just a girl's imagination fueled by grief or fear. But a voice in the back of my mind, the part that still felt the weight of Duke's eyes as he refused to follow me, kept whispering, she wasn't imagining anything. And neither was the dog. March 3rd, 1892. That was the first date Abigail wrote in her diary, her pen gliding with a grace that didn't match the harsh world she lived in. "The wind snapped like a whip through the barn rafters this morning," she began. "Elijah says the cows refused to move until Father came out and laid hands on them. I think they were just cold, but he says the ground is shifting again. From the start, it was clear Abigail Hensley saw things differently than the rest of her family. She was 17, but her words carried the gravity of someone much older. Perhaps that was the burden of growing up on the land they never left, a farm too far from neighbors, too full of secrets, too quiet for too long. She described her father, Jonah, with a tone that drifted between fear and reverence. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, his hands cracked from years in the soil. He read the Bible aloud at dusk each day, his voice steady, commanding. Abigail loved him once, she said, but something had changed. "There's something behind his eyes now," she wrote. "Like he's always listening to something I can't hear." Ruth, her mother, barely spoke anymore. She was a pale figure who drifted from room to room, her lips moving in silent prayers. Abigail recalled how Ruth used to sing while washing clothes, lullabies about rivers and stars. Now her voice was a murmur behind closed doors, speaking to no one, or to someone Abigail couldn't see. Elijah, the youngest of the family, was only 9. Cheerful, sweet, but often confined to bed with fevers. Abigail adored him. She wrote pages about his dreams of owning a horse, of building a boat to sail down the Ohio River. He was the only light left in that dim house. Their days were filled with work, feeding animals, chopping wood, tending to crops that stubbornly refused to flourish. Abigail noted how the land had grown harder each season, as though it resented being tilled. Jonah would mutter about the debt of the soil and ancestral blood, but never explained what he meant. Then came the hallway. Abigail didn't elaborate at first. She hinted at her discomfort, how she moved quickly past the narrow corridor that split the house in two. "It's always darker than the rest of the house," she wrote, "even when the sun is high and the windows are open, and it smells damp, like wet earth." Her entries turned sharper when she mentioned the animals. The dog her uncle gifted them stopped barking entirely and would lie flat at the foot of Abigail's bed, trembling if anyone walked near the hallway. The cat disappeared altogether. When Jonah asked where it had gone, Abigail lied, saying it ran off. But she found its body later, under the hallway floorboards, twisted as if it had died in terror. She wanted to tell her mother, but Ruth only stared when she tried. "Stay out of the hallway," Ruth whispered once. "Don't even look into it when the light's wrong." Despite it all, Abigail found comfort in her books, tattered volumes her grandfather had left behind, stories of far-off cities, explorers, and brave women who charted their own fates. In her writing, you could feel her longing. She dreamed of Cincinnati, of wearing a blue dress and walking beside a river with someone who asked about her thoughts, not her chores. Still, even her daydreams were shadowed by the reality around her. Jonah had started waking before dawn, standing silently in the hallway. Abigail once caught him whispering in a language she didn't recognize. When she asked what he was doing, he smiled a little too long and said, "Feeding the silence." That phrase echoed through her later entries. "I asked Elijah if the hallway scared him," Abigail wrote in a letter-style entry to no one. "He said yes, but he doesn't want to talk about it. He says Father told him the hallway listens, that if we say the wrong thing near it, we'll make it angry. I don't know what that means. I wish someone would just tell me the truth." That was the pattern, hints of something lurking beneath the surface, wrapped in the everyday tasks of a family trying to survive. The more I read, the more I felt as if Abigail had written not just for herself, but for someone who might one day understand. By the end of the second week's entries, the tone had shifted. She wasn't just recording observations. She was asking questions about her father's strange rituals, her mother's silence, and the things Elijah said in his sleep. I turned the last page she had written that week and stared at the words. "If something happens to me, it will start in the hallway, I know it, and no one will listen because even the animals already know. They just can't say it." I closed the book with shaking hands. The tone of Abigail's writing darkened in the following pages, as if her hand had grown heavier with each line. Her sentences became shorter, more fragmented, as though she couldn't bring herself to describe everything at once. There were no more idle reflections or wistful dreams. The entries now read like confessions scratched in haste. "I heard the floorboards creak last night," she wrote, "but no one was walking." It began subtly. Abigail would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps pacing the hallway, slow, deliberate, never hurried. But when she opened her bedroom door, the corridor would be empty. Still, the air would feel disturbed, like someone had just passed through. Once she lit a candle and held it near the hallway. The flame flickered violently, though there was no draught. On March 11th, she wrote about hearing laughter. Faint, almost playful, but completely out of place. It sounded like a child, she noted. But Elijah was asleep, and the voice was older than him, thinner. More cruel. The family had grown quieter, too. Jonah spoke only when necessary and began skipping meals. His beard grew wild, and his eyes looked distant, like he was watching something just over Abigail's shoulder. She tried to ask him about the footsteps, about the cold spot near the center of the hallway, but he brushed her off with scripture. "The Lord walks with us, even in darkness," he said. "Especially there." Abigail wrote that she didn't believe him. Ruth's silence took on a weight of its own. She no longer murmured prayers. She simply sat, hands clenched around a wooden rosary that had cracked near the crucifix. When Abigail tried to braid her mother's hair one morning, she flinched and muttered, "Don't go near it, not at night, not ever again." No one said what "it" was, but they all knew. Elijah, who had once giggled at bedtime stories and begged for extra bread, now refused to sleep unless his bed was moved away from the hallway's view. One morning, Abigail found him sitting upright at dawn, wide-eyed, his blanket pulled to his chin. "I saw her again," he whispered. Abigail pressed him gently. "Who, Elijah?" He shook his head. "The girl in the hallway." She doesn't blink. That was the first time Abigail realized she might not be alone in what she was sensing. The next few entries were erratic. Some were only a few lines. Others skipped days. On March 15th, she described how the oil lamps wouldn't stay lit near the hallway anymore. 3 times I relit it. 3 times it went out all at once, like something was sucking the flame into itself. Then came the marks. Abigail noticed them one morning as she swept the hallway, forcing herself through the corridor with tight steps and shallow breaths. Small indentations in the wooden wall, 5 of them curved like a hand pressed hard into the grain. She ran her fingers over them and felt how unnaturally smooth they were. "No human hand did this," she wrote. "It's too long, too narrow." That night, the temperature dropped so fast that frost formed on the inside of the window glass. Abigail could see her breath in her bedroom. She bundled in quilts and listened as the footsteps came again. This time they stopped at her door. She didn't open it. The next morning she found her crucifix, the one she wore always, split clean in 2 beneath her pillow. Still, she stayed. She kept writing. Perhaps because writing gave her the illusion of control, or perhaps because she knew no one else would believe her. Then on March 18th something changed. Abigail described sitting by the kitchen table when Jonah walked into the hallway and just stopped. He stood there for nearly an hour, motionless, facing the far end, which was cast in shadow. When Ruth tried to speak to him, he raised his hand without turning. Abigail crept closer and swore she heard him whispering, very faintly, in a language that chilled her bones. She couldn't understand the words, but they made her mouth go dry. When he finally emerged, his shirt was soaked with sweat. He smiled at Abigail, but his eyes were too wide, too bright. "Everything's clearer now," he said. "We've been chosen." Abigail didn't respond. She wrote in her diary that night, "He's listening to something again. It's not God." By the end of that entry, her handwriting had shifted, shaky, uneven, like her hand couldn't keep up with the weight of her fear. "I think something lives in the hallway. Not a ghost, not a person, something else. And it's watching us more each day. I don't know what it wants, but I think Father does." I set the diary down, heart pounding. The hallway was quiet again, but silence, I was learning, meant nothing. March 21st, 1892. The entry began with tension, but also with something rare in Abigail's writing, curiosity. "Thomas came again today," she wrote, "and with him answers I didn't expect. Thomas Weller was the neighbor's son, a boy of 18 with soot-stained hands and a cautious smile. He lived half a mile through the woods with his widowed mother. Abigail didn't see him often, But when she did, he brought warmth that felt like sunlight in a place where the sky rarely broke through. He wasn't just a distraction, he was a connection to the outside world, and for Abigail that meant hope. That morning he brought her eggs and bread, saying they had extras, but she knew better. He had questions in his eyes. "You don't look well," he said, glancing toward the house. "Neither do they." Abigail hesitated. She hadn't told anyone about what she'd heard, what she'd seen, not even Thomas, but something in her cracked and the words slipped free like water from a cracked jar. She told him about the hallway, about the laughter, the marks, the cold that hung even in spring. She didn't expect him to believe her, but he did. Thomas looked pale. "My grandfather warned us about your land," he said quietly. "Said there's old things buried here, things that don't die." Abigail pressed him, and slowly, reluctantly, he told her what his family never wrote down, only whispered. Before the Hensleys came, before Indiana was even part of the Union, the woods was sacred ground for a group known only as the Hollow Ones. They weren't a tribe or settlers. No one knew where they came from, only that they wore long black robes and never spoke aloud. They lived in silence even during their ceremonies. They believed the world was hollow, that underneath the skin of the earth, another version of it breathed, darker, older, alive. They called it Nethrus, and they said it listened to the places where no one dared speak. The old ones said the Hollow Ones built altars in places where trees wouldn't grow, places like the stretch of land, now home to the Hensley farm. "Your house," Thomas said, "was built over one." Abigail didn't want to believe it. Her father never spoke of anything like that. Her mother wouldn't even say the word curse, but something in her bones told her it was true. She remembered the burned grass near the well, the strange stones buried in the garden, and how the hallway always felt like it was watching. Thomas urged her to come to church that Sunday, said she needed to get out, but Abigail refused. She couldn't leave her mother or Elijah, not while Jonah was acting stranger each day. That night she dug around the baseboards in the hallway. She found something buried in the wood, a small iron emblem shaped like an open eye with a slit pupil, no larger than a coin. She showed it to her mother. Ruth gasped, snatched it from her, and threw it into the stove without a word. When Abigail asked what it was, Ruth only said, "We're not supposed to disturb them." The diary became more frantic after that. Her entries grew longer, as though she was racing against time. On March 24th, she wrote of dreams, visions of a circle of people standing in the hallway, their mouths sewn shut, humming without sound. She woke drenched in sweat, unable to breathe, her heart pounding as if something had just left her chest. Then there was the field. She followed Jonah one morning just after sunrise. He didn't see her. He walked out behind the barn to the edge of the woods, stopped at a large flat rock she had never noticed before, and knelt. Abigail watched as he removed his boots, then pressed his forehead to the stone for several minutes. When he rose, he turned toward the trees and said, "We hear you." Abigail ran before he saw her. That night, she confronted him. He said nothing at first. Then, after a long silence, he said, "This land isn't ours. It never was. But they let us live here, so long as we respect it." "Who?" she asked. "The Hollow Ones," he whispered. She left the room and didn't sleep. Her entry from that night ended with a single line, "I am no longer sure who my father is." The next morning she went back to the hallway. For the first time she stood in the middle of it and didn't move. She let it breathe around her, cold and still. And in that moment she knew it wasn't a hallway. It was an altar. March 27th, 1892. Abigail's writing changed. It grew erratic. Ink pressed deeper into the page, as if her hand trembled with every word. "I don't know what's happening to him," she began. "But it's not just father anymore. It's something else inside him, something listening back." Jonah Hensley, once stern but predictable, had become something far more unnerving. He no longer farmed. He no longer prayed aloud. Instead, he spent hours in his study with the door closed, his voice rising and falling in strange chants that Abigail could never quite catch. Sometimes she heard scratching, slow, deliberate, like fingernails on parchment. At dinner, he'd sit still as stone, eyes vacant, chewing as if it were a ritual rather than a meal. He'd stop mid-bite and smile at nothing. "They're hungry," he said once, before Ruth dropped her spoon and left the table. Abigail tried to speak to her mother about it, but Ruth's answers had turned cryptic. "We must endure it," she said, "like my mother did, like her mother before her." That word again, endure. It appeared in the next few diary entries repeatedly, as if it were the only word Ruth could say anymore. Elijah had stopped speaking entirely. He followed Abigail closely now, barely letting her out of his sight. When she asked him what was wrong, he would only shake his head and press a finger to his lips. Silence, again and again. It was as if something demanded it. Then came the dreams. Abigail described the same recurring nightmare. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with mirrors that reflected not her face but Jonah's. Dozens of him. Hundreds. And each reflection was smiling with a different expression. Rage, glee, sorrow, hunger. At the end of the hallway stood a black door, pulsing like a heartbeat, leaking smoke. She woke with blood on her sheets, a small cut across her palm, as though she'd grasped something sharp in her sleep. The next day she caught Jonah in the hallway at dawn. He was kneeling, shirtless, head tilted back. His chest was covered in symbols carved into the skin, some fresh, some faded. The eye, the slit pupil, the markings from the old emblem. His breath came in slow, shuddering pulls. "I offered them my pain," he said when he noticed her. "Now I see more clearly." She ran. Abigail spent the rest of that day hidden in the barn loft, clutching the diary. She wrote that she considered leaving that night, but something held her back. "If I go," she reasoned, "they'll be alone with him, and I don't think he's him anymore." Thomas came by again the following morning. Abigail didn't tell him everything, just enough. He looked deeply troubled. "There's a story my grandfather told me," he said. "Said the Hollow Ones sometimes chose vessels, people they could speak through, but it wasn't possession. It was invitation, willingness. They promised knowledge, power, and they always asked for something in return." Abigail asked what they took. Thomas hesitated. "Light, not just candles or lamps. The light inside people. What made them human." Abigail felt a chill in her chest. Later that day she found Jonah in the root cellar, surrounded by jars of dirt, ash, and bone. He had drawn a circle on the stone floor and was humming, his hands slick with blood from a cut along his forearm. He didn't flinch when she appeared. "You shouldn't be here yet," he said, "but soon you'll understand. You'll see how it all connects." That night, she barred her bedroom door with a chair. She held Elijah in her arms and didn't sleep. The hallway groaned. She could hear something moving inside it, dragging against the walls. Once, she thought she heard her name, whispered softly, almost lovingly. The next morning, she woke to find the door unbarred. The chair hadn't moved, it had vanished. Ruth no longer left her room. Abigail found her sitting in the corner, whispering over and over, "He's opening it, he's opening it, he's opening it." When Abigail pressed her, Ruth suddenly grabbed her wrist, her fingers cold and bruised. "Don't let him bring you into the hallway. No matter what he says, no matter what you see," Abigail promised, but she knew the promise would be hard to keep. The final entry of that week was short, 8 words scrawled with urgency, as though written while fleeing. "The hallway is breathing. I heard it exhale." March 30th, 1892. Abigail didn't begin with words. She drew. A rough sketch of the hallway, now cracked through the middle with heavy black lines. Below it, a smaller figure, Elijah, drawn with a void where his face should be. She didn't write again until the evening. "He's gone," was all it said. That morning had started like any other. Cold grey light filtered through the kitchen window. Ruth sat at the table, muttering over her untouched food. Jonah was gone. Abigail found Elijah's bed empty. His boots were still by the door, his coat hung on the hook. She searched the house, then the yard, then the barn. Nothing. No footprints, no sound, as if he'd vanished into the breath of the land. Panic hollowed her chest. Jonah returned 2 hours later, calm as ever. When Abigail screamed at him, demanded to know where Elijah was, he only said, He's where he needs to be. Ruth collapsed. The sheriff came. Gray-haired, slow-speaking, reluctant. He searched the property with 2 deputies. They scoured the fields, the well, the woods. They found nothing. No signs of struggle, no broken branches, not even a footprint beyond the porch. Abigail begged them to look in the house. They did. But they didn't find the hallway strange. It looked like any other narrow corridor in an old farmhouse. One deputy even chuckled. Spooky little stretch of shadow, that's all. But Abigail knew better. So did Ruth. When the sheriff asked Jonah if Elijah had run away, he replied, "He was called." The sheriff looked disturbed but said nothing. He left them with a nod and the advice to pray. That night, the hallway groaned louder than ever. Abigail sat with Ruth on the floor of the kitchen, both wrapped in quilts, neither speaking. The wind howled through the eaves like wolves circling prey. The lamps flickered, dimming each time the floorboards creaked above. Abigail wrote in her journal, "I think the hallway took him." She didn't know how else to say it. There were no signs of forced entry, no place a child could hide, and yet when she stood in the center of the hallway at dusk and whispered his name, the walls seemed to hum in response, not with sound, but with presence. On April 1st, she tried to dig under the hallway floorboards. She pried up 2 planks before Jonah appeared behind her. His voice was low, almost kind. "Some things should stay buried, Abigail." She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just waited for him to leave. He didn't. Instead, he knelt beside her and whispered something that made her stomach turn to ice. "Elijah was a gift. The hollow ones are pleased. You should be too." Then he stood and walked away, as if they'd just shared a prayer instead of a confession. Abigail wrote for hours that night. The ink on the page trembled with her fear. "He gave him away," she wrote, "not to God, not to death, to something else, something that lives beneath our feet." Ruth stopped speaking altogether. Abigail found her in Elijah's room, sitting cross-legged on the bed, humming a lullaby with no melody. Her eyes were open but distant, like a window with the curtains drawn. Abigail shook her, begged her to come back, but Ruth only blinked slowly and whispered, "He's quiet now. No more fever, no more pain." The next morning, Abigail found a smear of blood on the hallway wall, small, thin. Like a child's hand had been dragged across it. She wiped it clean before Jonah could see. Thomas came again that afternoon. Abigail didn't want to tell him, but the words spilled out anyway. About Elijah, about the hallway, about her father. He didn't flinch, he didn't call her mad, he simply listened. "I think you're right," he said. "I think the land took him, or what's under it. But I also think it's not done." That night, for the first time in days, Abigail lit a candle and walked into the hallway. She stopped in the center, her breath shallow, her body tense. "Give him back," she whispered. The air changed. It grew heavy, like water before a storm. The candle sputtered, then flared, blew for a moment, before extinguishing itself. The cold that followed wasn't just temperature. It was absence, a hollowing of the world around her, and in that emptiness, she thought she heard Elijah's voice. But it was distant, wrong, too deep. She fled to her room, slammed the door, and wept. In her journal that night she wrote, "If he's still alive, he's not whole. And if he's not alive, then he's not at rest." She ended the entry with a line so faint it nearly vanished. "The hallway knows I'm watching, and now it watches back." April 3rd, 1892. The first thing Abigail heard that morning was a bark, sharp, startled, unfamiliar. It sliced through the stillness like a knife. She rushed to the window and saw Thomas tying a thick-coated dog to the post near the porch. He looked up, eyes dark with urgency. When she stepped outside, the dog growled, not at her, but at the house. "I brought him for you," Thomas said. "Name's Scout. Half sheepdog, half something else. He doesn't like strange places, but he wouldn't stop whining the last 2 nights. Thought he might sense something." Abigail didn't question it. She needed something, anything, that could feel what she was beginning to feel. Scout refused to go near the hallway. She tried to coax him inside, holding out meat, calling softly, but each time they approached the corridor his body stiffened. He'd bare his teeth, low to the ground, ears pinned back, emitting a growl unlike any she'd heard. Then he'd retreat to the farthest corner of the kitchen and whimper. Abigail wrote in her diary that night, "Even he knows, and he doesn't want to see." Jonah ignored the dog completely. He passed it without a glance, muttering verses under his breath. Ruth barely acknowledged its presence. She was no longer fully aware of the house around her. Her eyes were always glassy now, fixed on the distance only she could see. Thomas stayed longer that day, helping to patch the roof and clean the garden. He kept glancing toward the house, asking questions in half-sentences. "You still hearing things?" he'd ask, then stop himself. She nodded. Neither said more. Later, they sat by the porch while Scout lay between them, ears twitching. "I found something," Thomas said quietly, pulling a folded page from his coat. "It's from an old family Bible. My grandfather kept it hidden, talks about offerings, about symbols meant to keep the hollow ones asleep." He showed her the sketch, a circle with 3 lines crossing its center, surrounded by 4 closed eyes. Abigail felt her stomach tighten. It matched a carving she'd seen weeks ago in the floor beneath her bed. She hadn't understood it then. "Your house," Thomas said, "wasn't built wrong. It was built deliberately. That hallway, it lines up perfectly east to west, like some kind of channel." "For what?" she asked. He shook his head. "I don't think you want the answer." That night Abigail couldn't sleep. She sat beside Scout in the kitchen, holding a candle, her back to the hallway. He refused to take his eyes off it. At one point, just after midnight, he let out a low snarl and bared his teeth. Abigail turned slowly. She saw nothing, but the air felt different, heavier, charged. She felt watched again, that familiar tightening at the base of her spine. She whispered Scout's name. He didn't move, just growled until dawn. The next morning she returned to the hallway's floor. She began prying up boards again, working in silence while Scout sat watch near the doorway. This time, beneath the 3rd plank, she found something. A small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in brittle cloth, were old family documents, birth records, land deeds, and a letter. It was dated 1856. The handwriting was Jonah's, but younger, cleaner. It spoke of a brother, Silas Hensley, who had vanished when they were children. Abigail had never heard of him. The letter hinted that Silas had been taken, that their father had been the one to open the threshold. There was no emotion in the writing, only acceptance, a strange, mechanical devotion. Abigail folded the letter slowly. "How many others?" she wrote in her diary. "How long has this been happening?" She shared it with Thomas that afternoon. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We need to dig deeper. There's more under that house. I can feel it." Later that evening, Jonah entered the kitchen and stopped by the hallway. Scout immediately lunged to his feet, barking wildly, teeth bared. Jonah didn't flinch. He looked down at the dog with disdain, then turned his gaze to Abigail. "You shouldn't let it stay," he said calmly. "It doesn't belong here." Abigail met his eyes. "Neither do you." He smiled and walked away. That night, Scout stayed curled against Abigail's door, growling softly in his sleep. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if something deep beneath it had shifted, listening more closely than ever before. And in her final entry for the day, Abigail wrote, "He wants me next. And this time I won't be alone." April 6, 1892. The air inside the house had changed. Abigail described it as thicker, harder to breathe, even when the windows were open. Ruth wouldn't leave her bed anymore, and Jonah rarely spoke. But when he did, his voice came softer, like a whisper meant for someone who wasn't there. That morning, Thomas returned. His face was pale, and he carried with him a bundle wrapped in canvas. "We need to talk," he said. They sat in the barn, far from the house, far from the hallway. He unwrapped the bundle slowly, revealing objects that looked like they belonged in a museum. Rusted blades, stones carved with markings like those from Abigail's dreams, a tattered cloth painted in dark red. "I found them beneath the floor of the shed," Thomas said. "Not buried, stored, like someone meant to use them again." They examined the cloth together. A map, crude but clear. It marked the house, and just behind it, an area shaded with thick black ink, a circle where the altar had been. Abigail's voice shook when she asked, "Do you think Jonah is planning something?" Thomas didn't answer right away. Then quietly he said, "I think he already started." That night, Abigail watched as Jonah entered the hallway and knelt. He stayed there for nearly an hour, unmoving, eyes shut. When he rose, he spoke 3 words into the darkness. "We are ready." Scout barked violently, pressing his body between Abigail and the corridor. Abigail didn't sleep. She wrote until her hand cramped. "Something is coming," she scribbled. "He's opened the way." The next day brought silence. Ruth didn't speak. Jonah didn't appear. Thomas returned and told Abigail what he'd found in a ledger hidden inside the chapel's crypt back in town. An old list of names, all from local families, each marked with symbols and dates. The Hensley name appeared 6 times. "Your family's been part of this longer than you know," he said. "Every few decades there's a disappearance, sometimes a fire. Always near this land." Abigail was too tired to be shocked. Instead, she whispered, "How do we stop it?" Thomas laid out the plan. The rituals depended on a structure, the channel of the house, the altar beneath it, and the symbols etched into wood and bone. Break any piece and the power could collapse, but it had to be done before the offering. Abigail didn't ask who the offering was. That night, Jonah tried to kill Scout. She woke to the dogs howling, high-pitched and panicked. Rushing to the kitchen, she found Jonah standing over Scout with a knife, his face blank, the blade already streaked with blood. Abigail screamed. Scout lunged despite the wound, biting deep into Jonah's arm. The knife clattered to the floor. Thomas, who had stayed hidden in the barn overnight, burst in and tackled Jonah to the ground. They struggled violently until Abigail grabbed the knife and screamed for them to stop. Jonah didn't resist. He just lay there, breathing hard, blood dripping from his arm, a strange calmness in his eyes. "They told me it would fight," he said, "but it doesn't matter." "The ritual is older than the flesh." Abigail pressed the blade to his throat. Jonah didn't blink. "I'm not afraid," he whispered, "because the hollow ones have seen me, and I have seen them." She didn't cut him. She couldn't. Not yet. Thomas dragged him to the basement and locked the door from the outside. Ruth remained in her bed, eyes fluttering, lips moving without sound. Scout whimpered as Abigail cleaned the wound. It wasn't deep, but it had cut close to the muscle. He licked her hand as she worked, his tail barely wagging. "I won't let him hurt you again," she whispered. "I promise." In her diary that night she wrote, "It wasn't just madness. It was devotion. And now that I've seen his eyes, I don't think there's anything human left in him." She ended the entry with a final note, one that shook me as I read it. "If we don't stop this, I'll be next." April 8th, 1892. The house was silent when Abigail woke, but not peacefully so. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the eardrums, as if the world was bracing for something to arrive. Scout lay by her bed, alert but still. Thomas had stayed on the floor nearby, knife close at hand. Jonah remained locked in the basement. Abigail had double-checked the door 3 times during the night. Each time, she heard nothing from below. No shouting, no pleading. Just a strange rhythmic tapping like fingernails on stone. She checked on Ruth next. Her mother was sitting upright for the first time in days. Her hair, uncombed and graying, framed a face that looked suddenly older. Her eyes were sunken but clearer than Abigail had seen in weeks. "You need to leave," Ruth said, her voice hoarse. "Tonight." Abigail knelt beside her. "Not without you." Ruth shook her head. "I can't. But I can still do something." She pulled Abigail close, her fingers trembling as they pressed an old wooden rosary into her daughter's hands. The same one Abigail remembered from childhood, the one Ruth used to pray with at dawn before anyone else woke. "There's a prayer," Ruth whispered. "It's not in the Bible. My mother taught it to me. Her mother taught it to her." "It's older than Scripture." Abigail's heart sank. "You knew." Ruth nodded. "Not all of it. Just enough to be afraid." She took a deep breath, then continued. They feed on what we give them. Pain, silence, obedience. That hallway is a mouth. It needs to be closed, and your father opened it wider than it's ever been. Abigail's voice cracked. What do I do? Ruth reached beneath the mattress and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, worn and yellowed. She handed it to Abigail. On it, the prayer. Foreign words, sharp angles of language. Abigail didn't understand them, but her skin crawled just looking at them. Say this, Ruth said, but only when it starts. You'll know. Scout growled from the doorway. Not barking, just a low, steady sound that meant someone was moving. Jonah. They heard it then, the basement door unlatching, but it had been locked. They were sure of it. Thomas bolted down the hallway. Abigail followed, heart racing. The basement door was open, no sign of Jonah. Just a smear of blood on the knob and a trail leading into the hallway. Abigail froze. The walls were breathing again. She turned and ran to Ruth's room. We have to go, now. But Ruth was already on her feet, standing straighter than she had in months. She clutched a rusted iron key in one hand, the prayer page in the other. I won't let him take you, she said. Come with us. Ruth looked at her daughter, something fierce and sorrowful behind her eyes. You go. I'll hold it back. Thomas appeared in the doorway, breathless. We have to move. He's not alone. They didn't ask what he meant. They didn't have to. Abigail reached for her mother's hand, but Ruth stepped back. Go, she said. Now. They fled the house. Scout led the way, limping slightly but fast. Abigail looked back once and saw Ruth standing in the center of the hallway, arms outstretched, lips moving in the strange language Abigail hadn't dared speak aloud. Then the door slammed shut. From outside, they heard the house groan. The kind of sound wood doesn't make unless it's twisting under enormous pressure. Windows flashed with unnatural light. The air turned foul, like burnt copper and soil long left to rot. Then, silence. Abigail and Thomas crouched behind the barn, clutching each other, Scout between them, whining softly. When the house stopped shaking, they crept back. The hallway door was open. Smoke drifted out slowly, curling around the edges. They stepped inside carefully. The hallway was empty. The floorboards were blackened at the center. The walls were cracked, symbols scorched into their surface. And Ruth was gone. Abigail fell to her knees. There was no blood, no remains, just her mother's rosary, lying perfectly still in the exact center of the corridor. She picked it up with trembling fingers. The beads were warm. She opened her diary that night and wrote, she faced it. She stood in the center of what we feared and gave herself to stop it. But I don't think it's over. Scout wouldn't sleep. He paced the house, sniffing the corners, growling at shadows. Thomas stayed up with Abigail, watching the hallway, knowing now that it wasn't just a passage, it was a threshold, and whatever Ruth had kept at bay, it hadn't retreated, it had only paused. Abigail's final line for the night, the house is quiet, too quiet, and silence is what it feeds on. April 10th, 1892. The wind died that morning. The trees stood unnaturally still, as if waiting. Abigail noticed it first when the birds didn't sing. Then Scout stopped pacing. He sat stiff, facing the hallway, tail flat, ears forward. Something was coming. Thomas had gone into town for supplies. He was supposed to be back before noon. Abigail remained alone in the house, writing feverishly. Her entries were shorter now, each one a breath caught between dread and resolve. And then Jonah came back. She heard the front door creak open, slow, steady. Scout let out a guttural growl that rose into a full snarl. Abigail dropped her pen and stepped into the kitchen. Jonah stood there, barefoot, shirtless, his skin pallid and stretched. His eyes had changed, the whites were gone. Only black remained, oily, endless. His mouth curved into a grin that showed too many teeth. Abigail, he said softly, as if he'd just returned from a long walk. You've kept the house clean. She didn't answer. Scout bared his teeth, fur bristling, but didn't attack. He stayed close to her, body rigid, like a soldier waiting for the command to defend. Jonah's gaze moved slowly toward the hallway. "It's open now," he whispered. Ruth couldn't stop it. Not really. She delayed it. But it's awake. He stepped forward. Abigail backed away. "Where's Thomas?" he asked. "He'll want to see it too." She said nothing. Jonah moved toward the hallway and raised his hand. The moment his fingers passed the threshold, the air shimmered, like heat above a flame, but colder. The hallway no longer looked like wood and plaster. It looked wet, organic. The walls pulsed slightly, as if breathing, a deep, slow rhythm that didn't match any human pattern. Scout whimpered but held his ground. Abigail found her voice. "What is it?" Jonah turned to her, eyes gleaming. "A gate, a mouth, a womb. It gives, it takes, and now it's hungry." She clenched her fists. "You gave Elijah to it." He tilted his head. "I returned what was borrowed. He was never ours. None of us are." She took a step forward. "I'm not afraid of you." Jonah laughed. Not loud, but long. A dry, rasping sound that echoed unnaturally. "You should be. But not of me. I'm only the door." Then he turned and walked into the hallway. Abigail watched him disappear into the shadow. He didn't vanish. He was absorbed. The hallway rippled around him like water closing over a dropped stone. Then, silence. Thomas returned moments later, breathless, sensing something wrong before she spoke. "He's inside," Abigail said. "And it's worse than we thought." Together they approached the corridor. The hallway had changed again. Now it seemed longer, the floor slick, the walls darker, as if soaked in ink. And sounds, quiet at first, then louder, seeped from within. Whispers, some in English, others in a language no throat should form. Thomas gripped her hand. "We need to finish this. If we wait, we won't get another chance." Scout barked once, loud, final. Then the door to the hallway slammed shut. Abigail screamed. Thomas pulled at the handle. It didn't budge. The house shuddered. Something was moving behind the wall. Not a person. Something large, heavy, slithering. Abigail pressed her ear to the wood and heard it breathing, but not like a beast. It was slow, measured, almost patient. She ran to the back room, grabbed the prayer Ruth had given her. The paper trembled in her hands. Thomas grabbed lanterns, salt, iron nails, whatever they could find. "Whatever happens," he said, "don't stop reading once you start." They returned to the hallway door. Abigail placed the rosary around Scout's neck. "I need you to keep me here," she whispered. Scout sat, resolute. Thomas forced the door open with his shoulder. A rush of freezing air hit them. The hallway groaned again. The air smelled wrong, metallic and old, like something from beneath the earth had been turned over and left to rot. They stepped inside together. Abigail held the prayer tight, and then the floor beneath them pulsed. From the far end of the corridor, something stepped forward. Jonah, but not Jonah. His body was there, but too tall now, too thin, his arms longer, his fingers crooked backward like claws. His head tilted as he moved, his neck cracking with each motion. "Why do you resist?" he said, voice doubled. "We offer you place, purpose. You are hollow. Let us fill you." Abigail raised the prayer. Jonah lunged. Scout roared. April 11th, 1892. The air in the hallway had returned to stillness, but the scent of earth and rot lingered. Jonah had vanished into the darkness, and Scout stood guard by Abigail's side, his body tense, one paw bleeding where a claw had torn. Thomas held her arm tightly, his chest heaving. They had survived the attack, but only just. Abigail sat down at the edge of the corridor, clutching the prayer Ruth had given her. Her fingers sore from gripping it through the struggle. "It's not over," she said. "He wasn't trying to kill us. He was protecting something." Thomas nodded, already searching the walls. "There's something under us, something we haven't seen." It took hours. They emptied rooms, pried up floorboards, and scoured every inch of the farmhouse. Then, in a corner of the pantry behind the kitchen, a wall that didn't sound quite right when tapped, they found it. A seam. Behind a false panel was a narrow staircase, winding downward into the earth. It wasn't a root cellar. It wasn't mapped in the original plans. Abigail had checked those in town herself. This was something else. Scout refused to descend. He sat at the top of the stairs and growled softly, ears low, but did not follow. Abigail stroked his fur. "Wait for us," she whispered. Then she and Thomas went down. The steps were old, carved from stone, slick with damp. The smell grew stronger the deeper they went. Mildew, iron, and something sourer. The lantern flickered in Abigail's hand, casting long shadows against the curved walls. Thomas held his knife high, breathing slow and steady. At the bottom, they found a chamber, oval, hollowed out from the earth like a cyst. In the center stood a pedestal, and upon it a black stone. Tall, narrow, smooth as glass, but radiating heat. Not warmth, heat. Abigail stepped closer and felt it in her teeth. The kind of pressure that made you clench your jaw without realizing. There were markings on the ground, circles, sigils, all etched in white ash, and bones, dozens of them, some small, some still with scraps of cloth, child-sized. Thomas crouched beside one. They weren't just taken. They were fed. Abigail covered her mouth. On the wall behind the pedestal, etched deep into the rock, was a mural. Primitive, crude but unmistakable. A figure standing over others, arms outstretched, its face blank, an open mouth where eyes should have been. Below it, rows of kneeling silhouettes. One figure stood apart. It bore the same symbol that Abigail had found in her room, the eye with the slit pupil. She turned to Thomas. "This isn't just a gate, it's a temple," he nodded. "And that," he pointed to the stone, "is the altar." Abigail stepped closer. The surface of the stone seemed to ripple. Faint voices echoed in the chamber, though she couldn't tell if they were real or in her head. Then she heard it clearly. A whisper, so faint she had to hold her breath to hear. "Abigail?" It came from the stone. She backed away, but it followed. "Abigail, stay!" Thomas grabbed her arm, pulled her back. "Don't listen." She blinked, shaking herself free of the trance. Then she noticed the small hollow beneath the pedestal, a pit barely 2 feet wide. She knelt and looked inside. There at the bottom was another journal, not hers, not Ruth's. It was old, bound in faded leather. The name carved into the front, Jonah Hensley, 1856. She opened it. Inside, the first page read, "They promised my brother would return if I opened the threshold." Abigail stared at the words. Silas, the name from the letter. The brother Jonah lost. The brother the Hollow Ones had taken. Thomas read over her shoulder. "He made the same deal." "And now he's doing it again," Abigail whispered. "Only this time it's Elijah. And me." Thomas looked at the black stone. "If we break it," Abigail interrupted, "we stop it. But it has to be now." She tucked the journal under her arm. They started gathering what they'd need: salt, iron nails, the prayer. Thomas drew a new circle around the altar, carefully disrupting the sigils on the floor. Abigail knelt and prepared to speak the words her mother had passed down. The stone pulsed once, then again. It was waking. They had minutes, maybe seconds. Abigail steadied her voice and began. April 11th, 1892. Later. The chamber had changed. As Abigail recited the first line of the prayer, the air thickened. The lantern dimmed, its flame flickering violently, though no wind stirred. The stone pulsed again, louder now, like a drum beating from beneath the ground. She tightened her grip on the rosary, grounding herself in its worn beads. Thomas stood behind her, drawing protective lines in the ash. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. The second line left her lips. The ground beneath the pedestal vibrated, and something behind the wall groaned, long, low, wet. Not stone. Not wood. Something alive. Then the whispers returned, but this time they weren't words. They were memories. Abigail blinked, and suddenly she wasn't in the chamber anymore. She stood in the hallway, her hallway, but cleaner, brighter. A boy stood at the far end, Elijah, whole, smiling, holding a toy horse he hadn't touched in weeks. "Come on," he said. She stepped forward, heart breaking. But just as she reached for him, the walls shifted. They bled. His eyes darkened. The smile widened, too wide. He whispered in her voice, "Stay." She gasped, and the vision broke. She collapsed to her knees back in the chamber, gasping for air. Thomas rushed to her, steadying her shoulders. "Don't stop," he said. "It's fighting back." Scout's barking echoed faintly from above. The dog paced at the entrance of the stairs, as if urging them to hurry. Abigail took a breath and began the third line. The room trembled. Dirt rained from the ceiling. A crack opened along the floor, narrow but deep, splitting the ash circle down the center. From it rose a smell that nearly knocked them back. Sulfur, decay, and something older than either of them could name. And then came the shapes. From the walls the figures emerged, slow and shifting. They had no clear form, only outlines of limbs and faces that flickered like candlelight in wind. Some were tall, some small, but all moved with the same terrible grace. They circled the pedestal, silent. Thomas raised the iron blade. "They're not real," he muttered. "They're not—" One brushed against him. He screamed and fell, clutching his side. Abigail reached for him, but her vision blurred again. This time she was back in the parlor. Her mother sat in the rocker, smiling gently, humming the lullaby from her childhood. Jonah stood by the fire, Elijah on his lap. The room glowed warmly. "It's all over now," Ruth said. "We're safe." It felt so real, so inviting. But Abigail knew. She looked at Ruth and asked, "What did you give them?" The smile faltered. "Everything," Ruth said, and the illusion shattered. She was back in the dirt chamber. Thomas groaned beside her, bleeding from the ribs. The stone now glowed faintly, veins of red pulsing beneath its surface like blood behind skin. The figures turned toward her. She began the fourth line. The light from the lantern turned blue. The temperature dropped so sharply frost formed on her lashes. Her voice cracked, throat raw, but she didn't stop. From the pit beneath the pedestal came a sound. A cry. Elijah's voice. Abigail dropped the prayer. For a split second she almost ran, almost dove into the pit to find her brother. But Thomas's voice broke through. "It's not him." She clutched the prayer again and shouted the fifth line. The figures screamed, not with sound but with vibration. The walls pulsed, the ash caught fire in places, the stone cracked near its base, small at first, then wider. The sixth line came out as a roar. Abigail's voice was no longer alone. Ruth's words echoed with hers, layered from somewhere deep inside. The stone split open. A blast of heat and light knocked them back. Thomas shielded her. The figures dissolved into smoke. The whispers stopped, and the red glow inside the stone winked out like a dying ember. Then, silence. Real silence, not heavy, not watching, just empty. Abigail sat up slowly. The crack in the stone continued to widen, and from it oozed thick black liquid that hissed and evaporated on contact with the air. The mural behind the pedestal had faded. The eyes had closed. Thomas coughed, sitting up. "Did we do it?" She looked at the stone, at the ash, at the bones. "I think we began it," she said. Scout barked again, louder now, calling them back. Abigail rose, helping Thomas to his feet. She clutched the prayer, now soaked with sweat and ash, and they climbed the stairs. April 11th, 1892. Dusk. They emerged from the stairwell, gasping for breath, lungs full of smoke and dust. Scout waited at the top, tail down, fur bristling, whining softly. The farmhouse around them groaned like it was being pulled apart from the inside. The boards creaked in rhythmic waves as if echoing a distant heartbeat. Abigail turned to Thomas. "It's not finished." He nodded, wiping blood from his brow. The stone cracked, but it didn't break. The house shifted violently, as though it had heard them. The hallway was no longer a hallway. It had become a mouth. The walls pulsed, coated in black moisture. Roots or tendrils pulsed along the ceiling, dripping a tar-like sap. In the center, the floor had split wide open, a gaping wound leading down into the dark. From within came a sound both familiar and grotesque. Jonah's voice. He was chanting, but it wasn't in any human tongue. Abigail stepped forward, prayer clenched in one hand, the rosary looped around her wrist. Scout growled but stayed behind her guarding. Thomas lit the last lantern and held the iron blade tight. "We go together," he said. They entered the hallway. The moment their feet crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted. Their breath steamed in the air. Whispered memories clawed at their ears. Elijah's laughter, Ruth's humming, the final sobs of 100 unseen voices. But Abigail kept walking. The floor vibrated. Jonah's voice grew louder. When they reached the center, they saw him. He stood at the edge of the rift, arms raised, face lifted toward a ceiling that now pulsed like flesh. His body had twisted further, arms longer, back hunched, skin paper-thin and grey. He turned toward them slowly, and when he smiled, his teeth had multiplied. "Too late," he said. "It's begun." Abigail stepped forward. "You don't get to decide that." She raised the prayer and began to speak. Jonah moved fast, faster than anything that should have been human. He lunged toward her with inhuman grace. Thomas tackled him mid-air, the two crashing to the floor in a blur of limbs and growls. Abigail didn't scream. She dropped to her knees, opened the prayer and began reading the final incantation. The one Ruth had warned must not be interrupted. Jonah roared, breaking free from Thomas. He surged toward Abigail. Scout lunged, slamming into Jonah's side, biting deep into his arm. Jonah shrieked, not in pain but rage. Thomas dragged himself upright, bleeding heavily. "Keep reading," he shouted. Abigail didn't stop. The words burned in her throat, each syllable harder than the last. The air thickened. The house screamed around them. The walls cracked. The floor rippled like water. Jonah hurled Scout aside. Abigail kept going. Jonah reached for her, hands twisted like claws, eyes leaking black tears. He grabbed her wrist. The prayer caught in her mouth. The ground opened wider. Thomas, with the last of his strength, threw the iron blade. It struck Jonah in the chest. He staggered back, roaring in fury, clutching the wound as thick smoke poured from the gash. Abigail screamed the next line of the prayer, voice echoing off every surface. The house buckled, the ceiling split, and from the opening came the sound of 1,000 mouths sighing in unison. April 11th, 1892. Night. The house was no longer a structure. It had become a living vessel, cracking, groaning, screaming. The roots in the walls thrashed violently, as if trying to pull the whole place inward. Jonah staggered back from the wound, black smoke billowing from his chest. The iron blade had struck deep, piercing whatever unnatural form lived beneath his skin. He dropped to his knees, hands shaking, mouth still trying to form broken syllables of the forbidden chant. Abigail didn't wait. She raised the prayer again and finished the next verse, the words now roaring from her throat. Her voice didn't sound like her own anymore. It was layered, hers, Ruth's, others she didn't recognize. Voices of resistance. Of bloodlines that had whispered through generations. Jonah howled. His skin cracked further. From beneath it oozed not blood, but shadow, dense and slow-moving, like oil escaping a broken jar. The rift in the hallway floor grew wider. It pulsed, a terrible maw gnashing at the seams of the house. From its depth shapes emerged, figures without detail, whispering memories in long-dead voices. One looked like a boy, another a woman, and dozens more undefined and moving with jerks and spasms. Thomas pulled Abigail up. "We have to destroy the stone. That's the root. The prayer's not enough." She nodded, but as they turned to run, Jonah rose one last time. His eyes, black voids now, locked on Abigail. "You think you win," he hissed, "but the hollow ones are patient." "You only delay what must be." Abigail faced him. "No, we end it." Jonah lunged, but this time he was slower, weakened. The wound in his chest split wider with each step. Scout leapt from behind and dragged him down. Abigail didn't stop to look back. She and Thomas ran to the cellar stairs. The house screamed around them, walls caving, glass shattering in rooms they couldn't see. The structure bent, but the foundation held just barely. They descended into the dark as the floor cracked above. In the chamber, the black stone stood tall but fractured. A red glow still pulsed inside, slower now, like a dying ember refusing to extinguish. Thomas grabbed the iron blade from his belt. Abigail stepped forward and poured the last of the salt around the pedestal, whispering the closing words of the prayer Ruth had taught her. I return what was stolen. I close what was opened. This is not your place. Thomas raised the blade. The stone pulsed once, then again. It began to vibrate violently, and then it shattered. A roar burst from within it, no sound Abigail had ever known. Not animal, not human. It was grief and rage and hunger all at once, forced through a throatless cry. The figures from the rift above howled in unison. The chamber lit with blinding white fire. Abigail fell to the ground, covering her face. Thomas shielded her, and then silence. When she opened her eyes, the chamber was still. The pedestal stood empty. The air no longer vibrated. The ash had blown away, and in the center of the room where the stone once stood was only dirt. They climbed back to the surface. The house was gone, not collapsed, gone. Only the foundation remained, blackened and cracked. The hallway was no more. The wood had splintered and turned to ash, and in the grass nearby, Scout stood waiting, tail high, ears alert. Abigail walked toward him slowly. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He wagged his tail. Thomas collapsed beside her, body shaking from exhaustion and blood loss. Abigail dropped beside him and held his hand. "We did it," she whispered. Thomas looked at the horizon, where dawn had begun to break. For now. They didn't speak again. That morning they left the land behind. Neither looked back. Years passed. Abigail never returned to the Hensley farm. The land, stripped of its house and history, was sold quietly to a man from out of state who planned to graze cattle there. Nothing ever grew right on that soil. The cows refused to settle. Within months, he left. Abigail and Thomas moved east, eventually marrying and starting over in a town where no one had heard the name Hensley. He worked as a carpenter. She taught children to read. They never spoke of Indiana, not to their friends, not to their neighbors, not even to each other. But Scout never forgot. The dog lived many years, longer than expected. Loyal, quiet, always watchful. He never let Abigail out of his sight. And even in peace, in quiet homes far from haunted fields, he would pause at thresholds, hallways, doorframes, dark corners. He would sniff the air, and sometimes he would refuse to enter. Abigail wrote one final entry in her journal on the night Scout died. She lit a candle, opened the pages worn with ash and time, and wrote, "I don't dream of the hallway anymore, not often. But sometimes I see him, Elijah. Not as he was, but as he could have been, older, wiser, smiling. I want to believe he was taken somewhere better, that he wasn't consumed, that what we destroyed didn't erase him, but I'll never know." She closed the book and placed it in a cedar box, locking it with the same iron key her mother had once used. She buried it beneath an oak tree in the yard. Years later, their children would play beneath that tree unaware, and yet, every so often when dusk fell just right and the wind moved through the grass like breath, Abigail would pause and listen. But the silence was clean. The land did not hum. The hollow ones, if they remained, had returned to sleep. Still, she whispered her mother's prayer sometimes before bed, just in case. She didn't believe in curses anymore, but she believed in memory, in what soil remembers, in what is passed down through blood. And when she died, decades later, Thomas placed the rosary Ruth had given her into her hands. The beads were warm again. The land remained quiet. But even now, it is said, sometimes the wind in Indiana carries voices. Not loud. But if you listen closely enough, they whisper names only the brave remember. And the dogs, they always know. If this story stayed with you, hit the subscribe button for more true and terrifying tales buried in the shadows of forgotten times. And don't stop here. Click the next video now to uncover the chilling mystery behind the Ash Grove Massacre.